One of my favorite things to come out of the FNAF community as of late is the trend of analyzing where Scott's mind was at as he worked on these games. Going back to where the story was likely at in his mind can help us paint a picture of where it is now and where things could go next. Today I wanted to focus on 4 games, 1 story, a phrase familiar to many of us older FNAF fans who have been around since the series' infancy. It was probably the most telling hint Scott ever gave us, but I think a lot of theorists, myself included, take for granted just how significant of a statement that is and how much it says about the game's narrative, the narrative of the games that came before it, and the games that will come after. Just what does it mean? Well, buckle in, and let me take you on a trip back in time. Let's go to the franchise's origins and try to get back into the mindset of when the games first came out to see if it helps us understand the story and how things got to where they are today. I think we can all agree Scott's plan for FNAF 1 is very simple, and why wouldn't it be? It was the first game. He had an idea of the missing children's incident, Golden Freddy, and the Bite of 87, but not much else. I don't even think it's that far of a stretch to assume that he didn't have a name for his serial killer yet. But one thing to note is that at this point, Scott wanted people to associate Golden Freddy with 1987 because of Custom Night 1987 input causing a Golden Freddy jump scare. Let's just keep that little fact tucked into the back of our mind as we move into FNAF 2, because everything else in this game appears to be spooky set dressing that Scott didn't think about too hard. In FNAF 2, Scott decides to answer the question of how the animatronics get possessed in the first place. The minigames all relate to the animatronic possessions and the origin of the puppet. When put together, they give you a really clear picture of a very impersonal story. A guy, who I still don't think Scott had even named yet, kills kids at Freddy's, and then those kids inhabit animatronics, who then go on to attack the security guards. We know the puppet is responsible for the possession thanks to Give Gifts, Give Life, and that the puppet was killed in a fashion separate from the other 5 kids at some older location which we see in Take Cake. Whichever location you think this is doesn't really matter at this point, but I'm 90% sure that Scott decided it was Fredbear's family diner, even though I don't think he had an idea of what Fredbear's was exactly. I mean, this game is the first mention of the diner, so it would make sense that this is the diner we're seeing and not just some Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. All this to say, I believe that at the time FNAF 3 was being made, Scott had the idea to pit Mike against the killer. This is what we see in the majority of FNAF 3's cutscenes. That's right, baby. I'm saying that there are 2 purple guys as far back as FNAF 3. Gibby's Horror Homestead has a great video on the detail of FNAF's minigames and how they're far more representational than literal. A purple guy doesn't mean it's the same person, it just means it's a man cloaked in shadow. We'll see Scott double down on this choice later, but for now let's go back to Mike. Mike is taking apart the animatronics here, which allows them to roam freely. Why? Because that's just kind of what happens. I don't know. The minigames are pretty clear about the order of events. Someone takes them apart, and then later we see their souls wandering freely. It makes far more sense that this is an action meant to help them rather than the killer's shoddy attempt to stop them, but either way, dismantling the animatronics doesn't actually free their souls. It just lets them get revenge on the one that killed them. And so, years pass with Mike thinking that he succeeded, but then FNAF 3 happens. He squares off with William, and the kids get their happiest day. Now there's just one last thing I want to talk about before we move on to FNAF 4. How many dead kids are there? No, I'm not touching FNAF 2's dead kid count with a 10-foot pole. Not today, at least. I don't think Scott thought it through when he made that game, even though I think there are explanations for the animatronics now. Rather, I'm referring to the dead kid count for the original missing children's incident. Lots of theorists have pointed this out before, but in FNAF 3's bad ending, there are lights representing animatronics still being haunted. But Golden Freddy has 2 eyes lit up and only 1 light ball. Do I think that this had significance as far back as FNAF 3? No. Because if it was, then in the final cutscene we should see 6 ghosts, but we only see 5. Let's go back to that light ball again, because there's something really important about it that I feel nobody is addressing. In game development, light is created with light sources. Duh. Each of those little balls that you see when you brighten the image is a light source within the game's engine. I think the fact that there's only 1 light source in the mask is a sign that Scott just kind of didn't really think the whole 2 eyes thing through very much. At this point in the story, I think it's pretty clear that Golden Freddy only had 1 soul inside of the suit. Do I think that this is the case now? No. FNAF's story has changed over the years, and clues and details get shaped and reincorporated into the modern lore constantly. I think understanding the evolution of its narrative will give us a clear idea of details that didn't make sense to us at the time, and I also think it's fascinating, so if you don't want to watch this, go away. So, what were we wondering at the time? What questions was FNAF 4 meant to answer? Well, it came down to 4 big ones. Who's the purple guy? Why is Golden Freddy like that? And what's up with the bite of 87? More importantly, how did it all begin? If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say that Scott had an idea of the answers to these questions while he was working on FNAF 3, but didn't really work it into the game's material because it wasn't fully developed. But then something happened that Scott didn't expect. That nobody expected. People hated FNAF 3. I don't think the hate for this game gets talked about enough. It was loathed when it first dropped. Critically, it did well, I am not contesting that, but there was an underlying hatred for this game, and I think that tracks with its player base. FNAF 1 through 3 were cultural juggernauts that everyone knew about, not just horror gamers. Need some proof? Well, I'm not going to go across every single YouTuber, but let's look at just one. Let's look at Markiplier's numbers for the first 4 games. Oh, well, would you look at that. FNAF 3 has the lowest view of any of the first 4. So why was this game so hated? Not for its story, no. You see, for its gameplay. Haters said that in the older FNAF games, jump scares were a punishment for being bad. In FNAF 3, you couldn't control them, it's just plain frustrating. They were also really pissed about only having one animatronic to worry about. They liked the variety of the other games. Not to say that this game doesn't have its defenders, but FNAF 3 was not received well by general audiences when it came out. All this to say, Scott didn't want us to let the series end here, and I think we can all understand why. So he starts developing the next game, the final game, for real this time. 4 games, 1 story. This one would answer everything. Well, not everything. Before we can talk about that, we have to talk about the things that Scott cared about when writing the story of the first few games. Or rather, what he didn't care about. Because unfortunately for everyone's favorite serial killer, William Afton, Scott really didn't care about making his evil child murderer a character when he made the first few games. Murder was just a vehicle for the plot to happen. Think about it. In the beginning, the only characters that we got who had names were the security guards, and Scott made the game that way on purpose. FNAF 1 doesn't name anyone in its newspapers, which, I don't know, that's pretty weird for newspapers. Why? Because it didn't matter to Scott. Who killed the kids? I don't know, some serial killer, man. Why does it matter? How do I know this? Because not a single piece of evidence ties the player characters together in the first 3 games. If this was something Scott had set out and understood to be true from the start, then I should be able to come to modern conclusions without evidence from games that never existed. And I know for a fact that Scott didn't intend anything more beyond what we found in FNAF 1 through 3. You know why? Because he said so. In Scott's Halloween content update for FNAF 4, he says, "You know, when I released the first game over a year ago, I was amazed at how quickly everyone found every bit of lore and story. Then the same thing happened with Part 2. Fans and YouTubers dug in and found everything. Game Theory did an incredible video on Part 2, getting almost everything right. Then, Part 3 came out, and once again, the story was uncovered by the community. It seemed there was nothing I could hide. But then, I released Part 4, and somehow, no one, not a single person, found the pieces. The story remains completely hidden." I take this to mean that the first 3 games were fairly simple in plot, bare bones as far as lore goes, and that we understood most of it as it was coming out. I know it's hard to think of FNAF's early history as anything other than story-rich because of what later games imply, but I think anyone who's read the Silver Eyes novel can tell you that the story didn't start out nearly as complex as it is now. And I think part of this was because Scott just still didn't have a grasp on the fine details of the story when it was written. I mean, think about it. When the first Silver Eyes novel came out, not many people were talking about it in terms of the lore. So, what does the Silver Eyes have to do with anything? Well, it was the first time we ever got a name for the killer. William Afton. And people did not like this. People were so universally uninterested in the Silver Eyes novel when it first came out that they would unironically get mad at you if you suggested that William Afton was the purple guy. This right here is probably why to this day there's confusion about what is and isn't canon in the books. But if you go back and read the first Silver Eyes novel, it makes sense. William Afton just doesn't have that much of a personality, and the little personality he does have definitely doesn't line up with the games, or even the books that came out later. He's just a different character. I mean, come on, Scott, a financially screwed Santa Claus, really? What does that even mean? He's just kind of there to be evil, likely to explain away the more cutthroat corporate policies of Fazbear Entertainment. So, when it came time for FNAF 4, Scott wanted to tie 3 relatively unrelated games together into one story. But what story is that? I think FNAF 4 was made to answer everyone's questions about the series. I said that time and time again in this video. But what I haven't said is that it was meant to answer all of them except the one we were most focused on. Our insistence on knowing about William Afton blinded us to the answers that we were being handed on a silver platter. But what is the story of FNAF 4? Well, it's the story of the Bite of 87. And before you start screaming at me about the TV Easter egg, I'm not saying that the game takes place in 1987, but rather that it explains how the bite happened. In order to explain what I mean by this, I need to go into specifics, so get ready because I'm about to talk about FNAF 4 for the next 30 minutes. To keep things as simple as humanly possible, in FNAF 4's daytime segments we play as a small child who grows up loving Freddy's. We know this because of his merch collection in the corner. From day one, we know that there's someone abusive in his life that locks him in his room. The Fredbear plush exclusively refers to this character as a he and uses the term very different from just any old pronoun. The Fredbear plush uses it as a title, a proper noun, a name. And so, on day 2, we learn that this he is the crying child's older brother who bullies him relentlessly, jump-scaring him wearing a foxy mask for kicks. And this, right here, is proof that William Afton didn't exist at this point, because William Afton isn't in this game, at least not as a father to his children. What is seen in the shadows is misunderstood in the mind of a child. Everyone knows what scene this is referring to by now, the crying child witnessing someone put on a Fredbear costume. This purple man is Scott doubling down on purple representing shadows and not a character. Or, if that wasn't his intention with FNAF 3, then it starts here. If this is William and he is the one bringing his son here, then why do we never interact with him? Why only Mike? Nothing indicates the man cloaked in shadow knows the crying child, so they're unrelated. But if this isn't William Afton, then why is the crying child being brought here 3 days in a row leading up to his birthday? Well, it's because the relative who works at Freddy's is none other than his brother, Mike. Have you ever asked yourself why Mike's friends are at a party for his little brother? I have a lot of siblings, and the idea of them inviting not 1 or 2, but 3 people completely removed from my age group to one of my birthday parties is kind of insane to me. If you've ever wondered why Mike and his friends all wear branded masks for the 4 main characters, you could say, well, it's because Mike and his friends are the only ones to show up to the crying child's party. Nobody came. But we don't see anyone else at this Freddy's, which would make it a remarkably unsuccessful restaurant. I think we can chalk up the lack of people here not as a showcase of nobody at the crying child's birthday party, but as Scott only showing us the characters who matter in this scene. And isn't it weird that not a single Fazbear employee stops 4 teenagers from carrying this crying child all the way up onto the stage and into Fredbear's mouth? He's kicking and screaming, he's crying, and it's a long walk up to the stage. It's because they're all the employees. It's the 80s, where teenage employees are common among fast food restaurants. At the time, people theorized that these 4 masked characters are the victims of the missing children's incident, but we know now in 2024 that this isn't the case. And if I'm stating that William Afton didn't exist as the crying child's father at this point in Scott's mind, then they definitely can't be the victims. So, what are these masks supposed to represent? Well, they're branding. FNAF 4 was supposed to show that Mike is a regular teenager who already works at Freddy's. He's wearing his uniform and he puts it on to torture his brother. But hey, I know I just dropped a miniature bombshell. You need more evidence. I get it. Well, remember earlier when I pointed out that the Fredbear plush only ever refers to the crying child's brother as he? Well, I was kind of lying about that. There's one instance where the Fredbear plush refers to another character directly, and it's this guy in the Fredbear suit on day 3. Normally, this would be an issue with my entire theory. It would mean that he could be anyone. But if Mike works at Freddy's, then this is Mike just wearing a different costume than normal. Now, I know what you're about to say. He has to be referring to 2 different people in the cutscene because earlier Fredbear says he left you here. Well, you know what else it says in that cutscene? You're right next to the exit. Yeah, the Fredbear who enters from off-screen is coming from outside of the restaurant. He's walking in through the front door. Mike didn't leave his brother, not really. He was just gonna scare him for a second. That's why the crying child is having his birthday party at Freddy's even though he hates it. It's convenient for his brother. Mike and his friends all work there. This decision also allows Scott to retroactively make Mike the protagonist across all 4 games rather than just the first and arguably the third. But why would the employees be wearing masks of the core 4 when the restaurant features Spring Bonnie and Fredbear as the 2 headliners? Well, to answer that, we need to look at what restaurant this game takes place in. So, is it a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza or a Fredbear's Family Diner? This debate stems from that tricky little FNAF 2 minigame, Take Cake to the Children, where we see a child that goes on to possess the puppet killed outside of an incredibly tiny establishment that many people at the time believed, and still believe, to be a Fredbear's. Therefore, because it is one room, yet the pizzeria we see in FNAF 4 has multiple rooms, they must be different locations, and thus, FNAF 4 cannot take place at Fredbear's Family Diner. But here's the thing. All of FNAF 2's mini-games are wildly inaccurate to the building's layout. The Foxy Go 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 minigame only has 2 rooms, and Give Gifts, Give Life is just a box in the void. FNAF 2 may not have had the most abstract minigames, I think FNAF World beats that by a mile, but I feel comfortable calling them the sloppiest. So, what can we turn to? How about the animatronics? In FNAF 4, we see 2 animatronics, Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. The only time we ever see this exact combination of animatronics up to this point is in FNAF 3. And of course that's the case, because that's when Scott invented them. But why did Scott invent them? Why put them on the stage in front of all the children in this way with no other animatronics? I think it's to show that this is a location where those were the only 2 animatronics, but not Fredbears. Let's go a bit further into the clues we're given. The FNAF 3 old training tapes that Phone Dude plays paint this specific combination as the origin of the franchise.
Hey man, okay, I have some awesome news for you. First of all, we found some vintage audio training cassettes. Dude, these are like prehistoric.
He specifically calls the tapes vintage and ancient. They're not from Fredbear's, but the suits are. Well, great. So if both the suits were in use at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and Fredbear's Family Diner, then how can we determine which location this is? Well, there are a couple other clues Scott has given us in this game. The first clue being the TV in the house that displays the year 1983. I'm going to break my rule about evidence from future games for just 1 second because I think this is a detail that Scott included in FNAF 4 but failed to elaborate on. For a long time, we've been seeing these Faz tokens in the games, since FNAF 6-ish. And on the coins, we see that it was established in 1983. This would place FNAF 4 in the same year as the opening of the very first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Need more proof? By the time the tapes are recorded, the suits aren't treated as their own characters, but rather variants.
Management has also been made aware that the Spring Bonnie animatronic has been noticeably moved.
We don't hear the Fredbear animatronic named, but the Bonnie suit is referred to as Spring Bonnie, which implies that there's a regular Bonnie animatronic and the main 4 are still present at this location. In FNAF 4, we know the other 4 animatronics exist as characters in the show, but we never see them in the pizzeria that the crying child visits, not even in the maintenance room he gets locked in. They're straight up just not present. But if even this isn't enough for you, I've got one big piece of evidence, and it's gonna make you feel like a moron. Have any of you people seen a goddamn diner before? This is not a diner. I have never seen a diner that looks like this before in my life. But you know what I have seen that looks like the FNAF 4 location? Well, the biggest things that come to mind for me are Chuck E. Cheese and the Happiest Day minigame. So no, this is not a Fredbear's Family Diner. I think I can finally stop beating this dead horse and move on. So, what does this all mean? Well, let's think back to before my location diatribe when I put forth the possibility that Mike works at the pizzeria at this point. You know what happens when little kids go to Disney World and don't see the character they expect? They ask, "Where's Mickey Mouse? I want to see Mickey Mouse!" In this case, Disney World is Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and Mickey Mouse is Freddy in the game. So what does a business owner do? You make staff wear masks to promote the new characters. Slowly phase out the promo material before bringing in the new animatronics and costumes. This is how real world places work like Chuck E. Cheese, so I don't think this is that far of a stretch. Where was I even in the story anyway? Between Mike and the location, I got so sidetracked correcting misconceptions I got lost. Right. So every day the crying child goes back to Freddy's and suffers mercilessly at the hands of his brother, and you know the rest by now. Fredbear gives him the old noggin chomp, and in the last cutscene we see him with his plushies, talking alone to his Fredbear plush again. A lot of people look to direct evidence from later material to explain Fredbear, but why? Fredbear is Fredbear, the character, crying child's imaginary friend, the plush given life by Remnant, whatever terminology you want to use to describe it. Scott has always believed in the magic of imagination. We see this motif come up a ton in FNAF, especially as the children have gotten more focused. I mean, think of how the doll talks to the crying child. It's narration, sure, but look at how it's written. He hates you. He left you here. It's childlike. These are the crying child's thoughts, spoken to us through Fredbear. Fredbear is a spiritual entity and the reason that Crying Child is able to possess the animatronic. Fredbear promises, "I will put you back together." Text color be damned, he's the one on screen. How do I know that this is the story Scott intended? Well, remember that August post that I brought up earlier? 1 week later, on September 1st, 2015, MatPat uploaded a FNAF theory to YouTube where he hypothesized that the Crying Child goes on to possess the puppet.
Who is the FNAF 4 kid, and what does the ending line of "I will put you back together" mean? Well, let me tell ya, the evidence points to him being the puppets.
The contents of this video aren't super important to me, but rather Scott's reaction to it. This is the second time that Scott has weighed in on one of MatPat's theories, the first time being to correct him when he incorrectly cites the Crying Child's death as the bite of 87. But what's so special about this one is how little information he gives compared to last time. All he says is, "I watched it and it was awesome." "But according to both you and modern evidence, that theory is wrong," I hear you saying. "The Crying Child can't be the puppet." And you're right. It's not actually his theory itself that's relevant. In that video, MatPat puts forth a lot of the conclusions that we take for granted today. Purple Guy being the Crying Child's father is a big one, but I've already gone through why I don't believe that, so what exactly do I think has value in this video? Well, at the end, MatPat puts forth the hypothesis that the Crying Child possesses Golden Freddy.
In short, the challenge here is that you have a choice. There's more evidence for our FNAF 4 kid becoming the puppet, but the resulting story is more satisfying for him to become Golden Freddy.
This is what I think Scott was referring to, and I believe the ideas presented in this video go on to inform a lot of his decisions with the franchise going forward. But wait a minute. Fredbear killed a child by biting their head? I'll spare you the obligatory Markiplier clip. Like I said earlier, I don't think Scott ever intended for this game to be set in 1987. A lot of people point to this as the one retcon in reference to a post Scott made forever ago, but that would put it at the same time as FNAF 2, which would be way too recent in the timeline. But I do believe that FNAF 4 is trying to tell us that Fredbear did the bite of 87. There's no doubt in my mind about that. How do I know for sure? Look at the promo material for FNAF 4. Was It Me was on each of the promo images, and 87 was all over the source code for Scott Games. Scott was pretty clear from the start that the bite of 87 was going to be important to this game, and Golden Freddy has always told us the answer from the very beginning. It's me. Most fans have pointed out by now that there are two bites, but I don't think they understand the deeper meaning of that. Why is the bite of 87 Fazbear history, but Crying Child's death forgotten to time? To get the answer, let's look at Fredbear's singing animation side by side with him biting. That's right, though this appears to be a bite, it's actually just the animatronic following through on its programming. Again, I'm not the first person to point this out, but why is it important? Because it's more likely to get swept under the rug as awful employees bullying gone wrong. Just fire them or move them to another shift and move on with their day. But to the Crying Child, to his spirit, he was bitten. And so the bite of 87 was likely an unprompted random attack by Fredbear on some poor customer or staff member. But why would such a peaceful child like CC behave violently? Well, at this point in the games, not only can we infer that there are two spirits inside of the Fredbear animatronic, but that they share one life source. Let's go back to FNAF 3's bad ending again for a second. I think this is the point where Scott decides that there are two souls within the Fredbear animatronic. After all, there were already 5 missing children, and here he was just throwing a new one into the fray. Either someone pointed out the two lights thing to him, or he noticed the flub on his own and decided to use it to his advantage. But here's a question that people have stopped asking about. If Golden Freddy has twice the spirits, why can't it move? Well, that, my friends, is because the 5th MCI victim was never given life. Let's look back to Give Gifts, Give Life for a second. The puppet never actually interacts with Golden Freddy, not once. I'm not the only person to point this out either. MatPat points it out in his September 1st theory that I brought up earlier.
It goes even further than that. In the FNAF 2 Give Gifts minigame, the puppet gives life to the dead children, with Golden Freddy as the odd man out who doesn't get a mask and does a ghostly jump scare at the end.
Time to go back to the FNAF 3 training tapes again. The first thing we learn about the safe rooms isn't that it's the backup safety location, but that it's reserved for equipment not being used, as in animatronics that get decommissioned.
The safe room is reserved for equipment and or other property not being currently used and as a backup safety location for employees only.
I don't think the suits are decommissioned when these tapes get made, but by the time the missing children's incident occurs, they would be. We know that's where the suits get stored because that's where Spring Bonnie's suit is stored during the FNAF 3 spring locking scene. We already knew that from the Follow Me minigames, the animatronics can't access the back room, so the puppet should be no exception to this. Golden Freddy is different not just because there are 2 souls in the animatronic, but because the 5th MCI victim was not given life by the puppet. The much weaker crying child shares what little life remnant whatever he can with the 5th MCI victim. Knowing what we know now about this MCI victim, I could see them influencing Fredbear to attack someone out of malice, and the spirit of crying child influencing that attack so that it becomes a bite. Now with that out of the way, we can get back to the death of the crying child. Or rather, just before his death. We know he survives for a while in the hospital because of the nighttime gameplay, but he's gotta die and possess Fredbear eventually. This is a great time for me to talk about that nighttime gameplay, actually. Specifically, who we play as. The community agrees it's Michael now, but I think it took us way too long to get there. What if I told you we could have figured this out way earlier if we just thought for 2 seconds? I mean, it's not hard. There are only 2 main characters in this game. First of all, the animatronics are called nightmares. No, that's not a clue about dream theory, but it is a clue that dreams are happening. Whose dreams, you may be asking? The crying child is afraid of the animatronics, so couldn't they just be his nightmares leading up to the bite? No, we know it's not because of the hospital stuff we see by the bed. We know the gameplay has to take place after the bite occurred, and because I really don't want to think of this as like fear purgatory for the dead crying child, and so the only character in this game we could be playing as is the only character who's alive, the crying child's brother, Mike Schmidt. What's supposed to clue us in on this? The fact that he's a Fazbear employee. But then Scott makes FNAF World, and at some point while working on it, he realizes serial killers are incredibly fascinating. The amount of idea formation in Scott's head as he made FNAF World is fascinating to me. I've touched on this before in my Mimic video, go check that out if you haven't, even though it's a year old, but FNAF World came out at a transitional period of FNAF's history. You can really tell that this is where Scott starts planning ahead. Kind of. I get the feeling that FNAF World was supposed to be a final send-off, but then we couldn't really figure out FNAF 4. But I think that during FNAF World's development, Scott had to have sat down and really wrote for a long while about everything that had occurred up to that point, everywhere he wanted it to go, and a roadmap to get to that point. He wasn't done with the series yet, but to tell more story, he would have to expand the world. It required a sister location. So he pens the story for Sister Location and drops a content update for FNAF World, a game that was originally meant to put the series to rest. But I think that's where I'm going to have to call it for today. I only wanted to get right up to where things get really complicated and iron things out. Sister Location is a huge game that really changes a lot about the franchise, and it really warrants its own video. This one is long enough as it is. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I know it took quite a while, but that was mostly because FNAF hasn't been giving us a ton of extra evidence to factor into our theories. I have another video in the pipeline, but it's going to take some extra time. It's not FNAF related, but it will be another theory, so stay tuned.